Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fifth edition of Africa Sessions, an initiative of Global Strategic Platform. The Global Strategic Platform is a non-profit organization based in California State, USA. The corporation is led by Professor Assis Malakias from California University in USA, Srikesh Laxmidas, Deputy Chief Editor from leading economic and business newspaper Jornal Económico in Portugal, by Professor Salim Valim Ahmad from Catholic University in Angola, and myself, Joel Costa. I'm a journalist. The main objective of this platform is to promote several cycles of conference in order to foster analytical dialogue between experts on crucial themes using an online platform and institutional support to bring the discussion to a wide audience. Beside live transmissions, the conference will be available on social networks for later viewing and may be used for production of writing materials. Well, that said, it's time to introduce you to today's topic. Natural resources and development in Africa after COVID-19. And our guests for today, participants here are Gleda Lam, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. Gleda joined Chatham House in 2024 and has worked on a range of international resource-related projects which intersect with geopolitical, economic, and development concerns. Other of our guests is Professor Assis Malakias, is one of the chair of the Department of Global Studies and Maritime Affairs at the California State University Maritime Academy. Dr. Assis Malakias is also associate at the Corbett Center for Maritime Policy Studies, King's College, University of London. We have also invited Professor Tim Swanson, Professor Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Timothy Swanson attended law school at University of Michigan and completed his PhD at London School of Economics under the supervision of Nick Stern. Our moderator is Philippe Galvão, professor at Graduate Institute in Geneva. Well, now I'll hand over to Philippe Galvão so we can start our discussion today.
Thank you very much, Joel. It's a pleasure to join today's very important discussion. I just want to briefly state the rules of the session. As it were, we'll have 3 rounds of questions for each of our speakers, and we will spend about 15 minutes with each round, with 3 rounds of questions. Just to briefly state, the first round will deal on the impact of COVID-19 in the commodities sector. The second round will explore and discuss African dependency on natural resources and the challenges to new development models after COVID-19. And the third, final round will deal with natural resources and climate change challenges. It is well known at this point that COVID-19 pandemic has been severely impacting the commodity sector, leading to a decline in agricultural, oil, and metal prices, as well as different kinds of operational and logistical disruptions and supply chain interruptions. While we seem to be currently in a path of industrial and economic recovery, COVID-19 will still have a profound long-term impact on the commodity sector. Some structural trends will be altered, others will be accelerated, and new ones will emerge. So my first question is for Gleda, and it deals with sort of the way in which oil and gas companies are already reassessing their investment and operational strategies. And the question is, Gleda, how do you think COVID-19 will change, be it altering or spurring or slowing down ongoing structural commodity trends globally and in Africa in particular?
Thanks, Philippe. Big question. So I think that COVID has sent shockwaves around the world in the last 8 or 9 months, and we've witnessed some trends in energy accelerating, as you say, that were already happening, but this shock to the system, when you saw oil go down to below $20 a barrel in April, and with ramifications for similar in a lot of the gas markets as well. You know, it really forced investors to question whether it was, you know, for how long would it be worth investing, you know, long term in oil and gas because of the transition that was already happening in energy. So although we know that oil prices then came back up, and you know we may see a series of spikes in future, it looks very likely that it's the end or the beginning of the end to the cyclical nature of those commodities, because what we're seeing in certainly from a OECD investment perspective is the major banks, the multilateral development banks, and the hedge funds having a very short-term interest in oil and gas, and that presents some difficult. I mean, you know, there was an announcement the other day from IFPRI of its shift to being a green bank, you know, with 100% of its investment aligned with the Paris Agreement by 2025. They're all moving in that direction. And the question is, you know, given their importance in supporting development of the industry in Africa in the past, you know, what takes over from that? I know there's been Asian investment, I know there's been domestics and some domestic local investment, but it does present a problem for the future, especially in building the value chain, as many countries, you know, want to do. Yeah, I'd say that in terms of demand as well. I mean, you saw BP last month saying that they saw you know, they estimate that peak oil demand has either already come or will come early 2020s, and so the big oil companies are preparing for that and trying to diversify into other fuels. So that puts into question, especially high cost investment in less developed countries. And I think, yeah, in terms of the changes that have taken place socially and politically, they have long-term implications as well, which, as you can see from this meeting, you know, that we wouldn't have otherwise joined. I think it's speeded up digitalization, remote working, and so there's a big question as to whether mobility will go back to normal.
Thank you, Gleda. And I want to pick up precisely on that, sort of to transition sort of the problem of social and political issues, to ask Aziz, based on sort of the question of protectionist trade and fiscal policies, which seems to be increasingly in the center of the conversation today, including greater royalty and tax policies, alongside growing social unrest incidents, leading in some cases to mine closures and disruptions. The question is, how do you think the rise in political risks aggravated by COVID-19, what does it mean for the commodity sector in Africa, Aziz?
Well, that's a very, very good question. Political risk. In fact, political risk in Africa are becoming almost synonymous. Let's look at some of the basics first. So you have Africa. We all know it's the second largest continent in the world, and it has massive natural resources. As you know, you got over 1 billion people sitting on about 30% of the world's mineral reserves. So based on this very powerful combination, on one hand, human resources, and on the other hand, natural endowments, one would have expected African countries to be some of the most developed countries in the world. But we know that, sadly, this is not the case. Africa's contribution to global trade stands at less than 3%. So to your point on political risks, you know, what is hindering development in Africa? When we ask that question, that's a very profound question. What is hindering development in Africa? The answer is political risks, and that goes to your question. It's political risks. If we look at the political landscape in Africa, what do we see? Some of the points were already mentioned, but let me just touch on a few more. We still see wars in Africa. We see terrorism. We see political unrest. We see frequent changes in government, and just as bad, inconsistency in government policies. What do we see? We see weak institutions, corruption. We see foreign exchange crisis, poor infrastructure. I could go on for several more hours just listing all these factors that hinder development in Africa. But imagine looking at it from the outside, maybe as a potential foreign investor. All of these factors that I mentioned represent risk. They make it very difficult for Africa to attract the needed investment from other parts of the world. On the one hand, on the other hand, it increases the cost of doing business in Africa. So why is this so important? Why is it that focusing on risk is so important? Yes, you could have all sorts of issues you mentioned, mines and so on. But if you look at it more broadly, this is important because most African countries still to this very day depend on export of primary commodities. That's what the economies of most African countries are based on, export of primary commodities. And also critically important, African countries depend on foreign investors to extract those natural resources for export. So obviously, if you have high political risks, you have investors who will be very cautious about coming into the country. You know, they'll make the calculations. High. What is the probability? An investor looks at the probability that his or her return will be. He or she will have a high return on the investment. If the political risk is there, high political risk is there, that calculation will not be a positive one on the investors' side. Let me just look at a couple of examples on the African continent. Let's look at Nigeria. Most populous country in Africa, richest economy, but it depends on oil for about 90% of its foreign exchange revenues. Massive political risks, political violence, terrorism, corruption. I could go on. Very weak fiscal position. Nigeria only, collects about 50% of its target revenue. Again, another example, the DRC. The DRC is so rich that it has an estimated $24 trillion of untapped mineral resources. $24 trillion. Now, basically, the DRC alone could support the economy of all the entire Africa if it was being well managed. But about 70% of its population live in abject poverty, never mind its opportunity or possibility of helping Africa develop. Again, why? Wars, political upheaval, and so on and so forth. High political risk. We could talk about South Africa. We could talk about Angola. We could talk about the whole entire Africa. So it has a massive, massive impact on commodities because Africa is so very dependent both on commodities and on foreign investment. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Aziz, and I'm glad you bring up the case of Nigeria and Angola. I want to come back to it in a moment, but now I want to bring Tim Swanson into conversation, and I think it's sort of still pursuing on the theme of instability, particularly around our growing awareness as an effect of COVID-19, our awareness of the vulnerability of food supply chains. And I guess my question is, what does COVID-19 mean for food supply in general, and the agribusiness sector in particular? Would, say, a renewed emphasis on food security lead to a rise in protectionism or increased efforts to boost local food production? Tim, I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this question.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. I think that the COVID-19 experience gave us a very nice, or not nice, but very vivid description of what kinds of risks there are from such episodes. And I think that there's already getting to be some information in about this. I happened to be in Zambia at the time that the lockdown started, and I was there. I landed about the beginning of February and was going to spend a couple of weeks, and it wound up taking me about 4 months to get out of Africa and get back to Britain. And that was a very minor problem for me, but in the process, I got to see an awful lot of things stopped at borders, and I got to see an awful lot of things that weren't moving and weren't happening at the time. The interesting thing is, and I'm going to make this a little more interesting by showing something other than my face here for a second. They're already starting to get some information on what this resulted in for Africa. I hope this is now visible. So this is an IFPRI publication that came out, the International Food Policy Research Institute. It's recounting what happened in terms of the food sector through the end of the summer. And so it's trying to make estimates based on that. It's by Joe Swinnen, and is already a published monograph out of Washington. And you can see that even though Africa was one of the less affected places, so far at least, by COVID-19, in terms of the hit on GDP, and you see in terms of the movement of goods, this is me stuck at borders. And in Africa, you can see that it's actually demonstrating the most profound impact. And that's because of that immediate tendency to start shutting things down and to disrupt these chains and to generate a lot of problems around borders and a lot of problems for people. So in order to turn this into, and these are estimates, here's an idea. This isn't broken down by Africa, but this is in thousands of jobs in the agricultural sector that were estimated to be affected, again, by the FAO and ILO during the course of the COVID crisis. And again, agriculture is very, very severely affected. It's very difficult to have any jobs operating when there's no chance to be able to keep things moving away from there. And so once things were put into lockdowns and once things were disrupted at any point in the supply chain, it worked its way back very rapidly into people's livelihoods. And so you see right back in primary production, the vast majority of the losses of livelihoods were being incurred. And this resulted, of course, in major losses in terms of poverty. And so measuring poverty as less than $1.90 purchasing power parity, you can see here for sub-Saharan Africa, they're estimating 80 million people that moved below that as a result of COVID, and that being a 23% increase. So I guess I think that COVID is an illustration, and going right back here to show again that Africa is suffering worse when it was actually suffering the pandemic least through a lot of this time. Illustrates the peculiar difficulties and problems to be solved with regards to supply chains and the weaknesses there that wind up rapidly, rebounding to the loss of a lot of the poorest population there. So I think COVID-19 has given us a nice, again, not nice, a vivid illustration of the kinds of difficulties that we face, the specific and special difficulties that we face when talking about borders and supply chains in Africa.
Thank you very much, Tim. A vivid illustration indeed. And I want to sort of pursue on precisely that theme of the extent to which these tendencies were already pre-existing to some extent. And I would like to start the second round of questions. We'll be shifting and reversing the order of presentation. So Tim will actually go first now. The second round is mainly about African dependency on natural resources and what that means, what kind of challenges it poses in terms of thinking of new development models after COVID-19. As Tim was already suggesting, I think the pandemic potentially amplifies and exacerbates existing tendencies, namely that Africa must move rapidly towards diversified economies, mostly given the vulnerability to its fossil fuel market, as well as the time that it will take for Africa's oil exporting countries to recover from the pandemic. So my question for Tim is, for many, this is a moment of reflecting and rethinking development models for Africa. Issues such as regional integration, the strengthening of local production, the integration of informal markets, or again, the diversification of production have come and put on the table as issues to think about. Is this a moment of opportunity or a moment of reckoning for Africa? Are natural resources really a curse or a failure in resource management? Or is there a path for more sustainable development, even tied to natural resources? Tim, the floor is yours again.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. I'll switch from the very specific to the very abstract. This is actually the field in which I'm professorial, and so I speak oftentimes in the most conceptual levels about this. The way that those of us who work in the field see natural resources and growth and development is that there's no clear relationship. There's no reason why these things should be a curse. There's no obvious problem with regards to having resources. If there's certainly not causation, but we do see that that there should be a goal with regards to developing countries that are primary resource exporters, that that there should be an attempt to try to rebalance assets and capital bases, that the kinds of richness that was mentioned by Assis is important, but it's important primarily because of it's an initial endowment that needs to be worked and moved and changed and developed. Most, if not all, countries start with this kind of a resource base and this kind of a problem to solve. And what we want and hope to see out of these countries is that they move into a much more diverse, broad portfolio that incorporates not just physical capital, which was what we mean by machinery and tools and factories and so on, but increasingly then into human capital, education, of course, which is one is shown again and again in studies to be one of the longest and longest term and most important investments for society to make into the human capital of the country. And then, as it's again has come up already in everyone's talks, the social capital, to be able to develop the rule of law and the governance institutions and the capacity to allow things to work within countries and across borders. So natural resource wealth is important, but it's really important that it's harvested in order to be reinvested in other capital stocks. That's the lesson that I think we always try to argue. Again, let me take your eyes off of me just for a second and show you what it is that I am referring to. So the resource curse, of course, is just this long-standing argument about whether or not resources are associated with positive or negative growth. I think that's a bit of a red herring. The more interesting and important thing is that, of course, the lower income countries have got a larger, this is a World Bank description of the situation, a larger natural capital base in their capital portfolio. But I think the important thing that I'm saying here is that it's not so much the larger natural capital base, but you see it implies a smaller intangible capital. The intangibles being that human capital and that social capital. And that's what's missing in a lot of these countries, those investments in those fundamental alternative ways. So it's important, and it's really important that the value of those natural resources are worked and managed and developed in order to flow into these new capital accounts, in order to try to make these countries stronger and more developed in the long term.
Thank you, Tim. This was an excellent segue also to my next question, which I would like to pose to Gleda. Regardless of how one positions himself or herself vis-a-vis the so-called resource curse or the Dutch disease, and there's been sort of a long-standing debate around it, it is a matter of fact that increasingly many countries in Africa are greatly dependent on natural resources revenues. So taking into account that many major companies are already starting to disinvest from fossil fuels and hydrocarbon exploration more broadly, is this the right time for governments in Africa to speed up a plan for diversifying the economy in order to cushion or prepare an exit from fossil fuels? Gleda, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Philippe. It's a really good question because I think the COVID experience is giving every society a chance for reflection and a chance to look to what they would want to change. In spite of suffering crisis in many countries, I think there is a desire now to take a different pathway, because clearly, just looking at the health impacts of COVID, it's clearly hit the most vulnerable the hardest, and that's the same, and the recession is coming on top of that. And as Tim has just pointed out, the African countries, some of the poorest African countries have been worse affected by issues like food security. So I would say there is a chance to reflect. I think from what we've seen in the past, in terms of diversification, it's never happened when the oil price is high. So I mean, I've worked a lot on the Gulf countries, and which are very highly dependent on their extractives exports, and it's only when the price fell in 2014 that a lot of more progressive reforms came in. One of those is to change the price incentives, because if you have entrenched subsidies, regressive subsidies on fuel and on power and on maybe water and other products, then subsidies that benefit actually the rich more than the poor, then you're losing the potential to drive a transition towards not only a cleaner but also a fairer economy, and especially in terms of countries that depend on their exports, they could be losing revenue through domestic use. Now, I know that's not the case for all African countries, but some of them still have issues with subsidies, and that's partly an issue of trust as well. I think coming back to our thesis point as well, if the public do not trust the government to redistribute the income from subsidy reform fairly, then they will be out in the streets protesting. And so there's a huge issue of transparency and accountability that has to go along with price incentive reform. We know that. I think alongside that, the need to look at environmental standards, and sometimes the two can come together. I think there's interesting development of carbon tax in South Africa, which I think is very interesting at an early stage, but gathering the data. And I was interested to hear, I was quite surprised to hear actually, a lot of other early producers being interested in that mechanism as a potential way to reform the tax system and perhaps gain an extra source of revenue while diversifying. Great, it's a real chance to transform infrastructure, especially public infrastructure, city infrastructure. Governments all over the world are looking to create jobs, so building things is at the forefront of their mind. But let's not build in the way that we are used to, because that will simply lock in the same inefficient and wasteful consumption patterns that we've suffered from in the industrialized countries. So I think there's a chance to look at how to really develop something I think indigenously beautiful in many African cities. For example, when I went to visit Nairobi or Cote d'Ivoire, Abidjan, or Accra, you see opportunities to build things differently, to maintain some of these beautiful hardwoods that grow in the city, to maintain green space, to build in a more passive way that doesn't demand constant inputs of fuel and electricity, to change the way that mobility works. I hope that countries can attract the right investment for that. And there is green climate finance, there is investment that wants to flow into those things. And I think it comes back to Asis's point. I think if the political environment can be conducive to that, the money will flow in. And I think I just wanted to reflect on maybe a wider problem of this obsession with growth, economic growth, which has not, if you look at the GDP levels for sub-Saharan African countries, maybe over the last 20 years, you see when there was a commodities boom, they shoot up. When there was a bust, they come down. And that's very, very damaging for an economy to work on that basis, and all their credit is tied to those ratings. Now, I think there is a global shift coming in the way that we will no longer be looking at just GDP. GDP is a useful benchmark, it's a useful measure, but we'll also be, increasingly interested in well-being, especially after COVID. Interesting to see that the UK was willing to take, a reduction in GDP of about 20% for the sake of well-being. I think that's happened in many countries. For greater equality, because that is a measure of stability and the potential for a good business economy going forward, and also thirdly, a regenerative economy, because we've done so much damage to, and that coming to Tim's point, but maybe a change in the concept of what is natural capital. Natural capital is also the biodiversity that you have, the fresh water, the clean air, the ability to be resilient as well against climate change. So I think there's an interest now in what investments can increase that regenerative factor. And a lot of the African countries already have a lot of those wonderful assets in terms of forests and biodiversity. Now they are challenged. I know there are many challenges with deforestation and desertification, but with the shifting, with the shifting global values and the way that maybe credit ratings will be assessed in future, I think there's a chance to look outside of the old extractive to export model, which has been so damaging to the progress on equality and well-being.
Thank you very much, Gleda. I think we have a lot of food for thought already in the second round of questions, which was to recall about natural resources and economic development models. I think the point Tim raised on human and social capital, as well as Gleda's point on both infrastructural development and a more inclusive economy, are great points for pursuing the conversation. But I want to now hone in on the specific experience of some of the countries that have gone through some of these challenges. And I would like to ask Assis, what would phasing out of fossil fuels look like for countries such as Angola or Nigeria, where almost 70% of their national budget depends on oil revenues, and also taking into account the possibility and the risk of devalued assets if they don't take it from the ground in the near future. What would be a realistic time frame, in your opinion, Assis, regarding this phasing out of fossil fuels?
You're asking me some very, very difficult questions. Very important, but very, very difficult questions. On the time frame, for example, I'm not an optimist or nor a pessimist, but time frames for a country like Nigeria, for a country like Angola, it's nearly impossible to determine. I don't want to say will never happen, because never is a very long time, but it's going to be incredibly difficult, very, very difficult for both Angola, Nigeria, Congo, and so on. But let me explain why I think that is the case. Well, yes, these African countries can hit rock bottom. And because the rock bottom is a really tough place to be at, they will have to do something. But it will take a very long time before they absolutely hit rock bottom, for reasons that we can also explain a little bit. Well, there are several aspects that we need to isolate. There's the environmental aspect. They may force countries to act and act quickly. But also, on the other hand, you have the political and some economic aspects that will force countries to go very slow. And that has a lot to do with, let's just call it the political economy of resource management in African countries. It is the resources that are fueling on one hand, they're fueling corruption on the one hand, but also on the other hand, they're lubricating all sorts of networks. Without those lubricants, there will be systemic failure, especially at the political level. This is what we have to keep in mind. It's about the survival of the regimes. Keep in mind, we all know that most of those regimes don't really have a strategic sense of direction. That is to say, they don't really know. If you ask them, if you sit down and ask them, okay, Angola, when you grow up in 50 years, where are you going to be? Where exactly are you going to be? Where is your end state? You say that, look, I have arrived. What does that destination look like? They have no idea. They have zero idea. You go to Nigeria, same thing. In my previous life, I worked for the U.S. government. I was in Africa all the time. I basically know the whole entire African political and security elite. They have no idea where they're going. If you ask the Nigerians, their idea of the strategic end state looks a bit like London. And I keep telling them, you will never be London ever. Just forget about it. You have to be Lagos. You have to understand that the transformation from Lagos to London will never happen. You go to Luanda, same thing. You ask them, they'll articulate some things, but you basically saying, okay, well, what you're describing sounds like Lisbon to me. I know Lisbon very well. What you're describing sounds like Lisbon to me, or Dubai, or whatever. You'll never get there. You'll never get there. So they do not have a sense of strategy. They don't have a sense of strategy. They kind of lost in this search for models that may rescue them from their current condition, and they may kind of bring them to a place, to a destination that everybody knows that they will never reach. So that is the problem. So phasing out for them makes no sense. It makes no sense until the last petrodollar disappears, until the last piece of hardwood disappears. They will continue to extract that last dollar to lubricate the networks upon which they depend to survive. Now, if they had a sense of strategy, they would diversify. There's no there's no magic. It's straightforward. You have to diversify, but diversification is not that easy. It's not that easy. It's not just an economic concept. It's fundamentally a political concept, because diversification hinges on good governance. It hinges on good governance. If you have no good governance, you can get to diversification accidentally, but without good governance, you cannot get there in a deliberate, calculated, strategic way. Good governance implies the absence of conflict. You have to create a condition, politically, socially, economically, environmentally, and so on. You have to create conditions that do not enable conflict. In fact, those conditions should enable investment, should enable trade, and all of those things that society really needs to develop. You need good policies. You need good policies. Again, there's nothing, this is very, very straightforward. You need good policies, both in terms of the design and the implementation of good policies. You need to be able to identify what are the fledgling sectors that need support, that need a little bit of a push. What are the policies you have to ensure that stability, especially macroeconomic stability, critical. All of what we're talking about here is good governance. Without good governance, you don't have any of this. And if you have good governance, then you could use natural resources as a driver for economic diversification. These are some of the things that my colleagues on the panel already talked about. You could have diversification if you use the natural resources, what you're getting out of natural, the monies, the monies that you're getting out of natural resources, reinvest them somewhere else. Don't just spend them. Look at Angola, for example. It's almost like every week there's another revelation of hundreds of millions of dollars. They were deposited somewhere. It was about a month ago, there was a revelation of $900 million found in a Swiss bank account that another high-level government official just took out of Angola and deposited in a Swiss bank account. The Swiss don't need the money. The Swiss don't need the money, let me tell you. But Angola needs the money. Reinvest that money into manufacturing, tourism, services. Just just figure out the policy framework and reinvest the money in sectors that will then diversify the economy. You cannot diversify the economy by stealing the money and putting it in Swiss bank accounts. That will never happen. You will diversify the Swiss economy, but not the Angolan economy. You need to focus on regional integration. Very, very important in the African context. Why? Again, this is economics 101, economies of scale. Economies of scale. The African economies are simply too small. I live in California now. The GDP of California is bigger than the GDP of the whole continent of Africa. This is the reality. The African economies are too small. You have to come together regionally to create a bit of economies of scale. And you also, just finally, I don't want to go on and on, but finally, you have to take advantage of international opportunities. Again, look at Africa's contribution of the world's GDP. It's very, very small. Look at Africa's contribution to world trade, very, very small. Look at Africa's share of global manufactured exports. It's close to zero. It's close to zero. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunities for growth there. Whether we're talking about South-South, something that we've been talking about forever, or China. A lot of people are very ambivalent about the relationship between China and Africa, but there's an opportunity there that could help diversify. The European Union, even the United States, AGOA, and so on. So there are opportunities there. But again, I'll go back to my original point. The African elites, the political elites at least, I have to have a sense of direction, a sense of strategic direction, a sense of understanding what Africa can become down the road. Africa will not become a replica of Europe or the United States or China. The Africans will have to develop their own sense of strategic direction, understanding of where they need to arrive at, where destination is down the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aziza. I think this was a very enlightening contribution. And I think it's also a very interesting point of passage into our third round of questions, this time around tied to natural resource and climate change challenges. So we've been discussing sort of different kinds of economic paradigms, the problem of good governance, different kinds of opportunities. But I think Africa is at a crossroads to some extent in that although climate change may not be a priority for African governments in this post-coronavirus world, at the same time, economy, development, and ecology are two sides of the same coin, if you will, the same developmental coin. So my first question is for Gleda, and I want to ask, considering that it seems that governments are caught between these two agendas, on the one hand, meeting development goals, using available natural resources, while at the same time, trying to achieve certain kinds of climate action targets or being forced to do so. At the intersection of these two agendas are stranded assets. It is known that climate change is a driver of asset stranding, but there seems to be some low awareness among African policymakers of this issue. So in your opinion, how would climate change impact the prospects and the choices for developing countries, particularly oil and gas producers, Gleda?
Thanks, Philippe. You don't ask easy questions, do you? So I think that the importer countries and the richer countries really have a responsibility here to start sharing much more transparently what's going on in the circles of finance and investment, and future strategy for for some of the big importers, and that includes Europe, the US, China, and so on, because the conversations that we're sometimes party to, they're just not heard in some of the African oil exporting countries. And so when you have this, I've been to Tanzania or Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, and we start raising some of the terminology, some of the narratives that are raised in the OECD and some of the multilateral fora. And of course, there's a rather violent reaction to them, because they have the decision makers. They have not been socialized into those debates. Now, I think that is starting to happen. I hope it's starting to happen, because we need a lot more transparency there. We could use fora like the Extractors Industries Transparency Initiative to encourage greater transparency between importers, exporters, investors on that issue, because this is really going to be about a managed decline, and we know that's going to be turbulent, and we want to try, the aim would be to make it as smooth as possible to cause the least disruption. And there's a lot of concerns about winners and losers, and people trying to squeeze as much value out of the resources that they can get out of the ground before they lose their value. So, or plans for using them domestically, but there are issues with that as well. If you're not receiving the export revenue to fund commercial investment in the infrastructure. So there's a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty, but I think there's also some opportunities as well. Unfortunately, I mean, you talk about climate change, just in terms of the physical impact. We know that some of the producers or prospective producers are also very hard hit and going to be very hard hit by climate change itself. So you've seen the storms in Mozambique, the flooding in Sudan. I mean, these are horrific and tragic tasters of what is to come. So the emphasis, especially in financial transfer from richer countries to developing ones, and technological transfer, should really be concentrating on resilience right now, and a type of resilience that does not generate, a more wasteful and an economic future. So that's the big challenge, I think, in terms of partnerships, especially for the MDBs, to be addressing those two issues at the same time. And I guess, finally, there are international conversations and opportunities now that really point towards opportunities to leapfrog in terms of technology, to avoid a pathway of very polluting and inefficient industrialization. Now, I know industrialization is a very hot topic in sub-Saharan Africa. How can we industrialize and make sure that we don't simply export our raw materials? How can we grow our value chains? Now, I think that's something that has to become a national discussion quite urgently. I think it just plays to Asis's points really about strategy. There have been some interesting examples. I know in Ghana they had a big consultation with civil society and universities and various political groups on their 2047 vision, and in other countries, in Kenya, they've looked to 2030 or so on. And I think that process is really important, to keep going with that process, to keep making sure that views are included on what you would want the role of the sector to be in your economy going forward, given the risks, the carbon risks, as you might call them, and the climate risks that you'll be facing going forward. So to see this as a moving, dynamic picture of change, and how can you, reduce your risks and also maximize your capture of the new opportunities that will be appearing on the international markets, as well as the domestic and the regional ones.
Thank you very much, Gleda. This next question is for Tim, and I think it's right in your wheelhouse. It's somewhat usually said that major polluters like China or the US seem to be dodging their responsibilities to mitigate carbon emissions. And meanwhile, Africa is responsible for less than 5% of emissions, but bears the brunt of a lot of these climate change effects. So if most African countries lack the resources or the capacities to simply switch to cleaner fuels and technologies in the near future, I guess my question to you, Tim, is should a delayed transition be on the table? And should these governments negotiate the use of resources at their disposal to accelerate socioeconomic transformation, while at the same time, if possible, pursuing low carbon development? What's your take on this?
My take is precisely so, that I think that the responsibility for solving these problems does not lie in Africa or with Africa. And I think that it's absolutely critical that that's accepted and part of the negotiating environment, and that that's transparent. Africa is responsible for about 3% of the historical emissions, and this is nothing. And if you look at the simulations where they look at what happens if you ban fossil fuels at about 2.5 degrees temperature increase, and fuels are extracted along the supply curve, in terms of increasing costs, you'll strand a tremendous amount of Africa's capital in the ground. And I think that would be a shame. I think that would be a terrible thing to do. And you cite China as an emitter, but in fact, I think that it's the pathway. I've actually been involved as an advisor to the Chinese government since about '95 as a member of the China Council, an advisory group that advises China on environment and development. And they've trod a fairly, speaking of strategic visions, a very clear and very a very sound, I think, pathway. I mean, at least I think reasonably based from most perspectives. When I first got to China, it was very poor, and I would guess it was about 750 million people still by '90 were living in the countryside. And when we talked to them about environment and development, it was pretty much the government's response that growth first, and that was that. And the Environment and Development Council had minor wins in terms of things like pollution pricing and such. By the year 2000, that had started to shift. And that next decade we started to focus more on the justice part, the quality of environment. Moved towards having, 500 million people move from very poor livelihoods in the countryside into now fairly polluted cities. But the government still had growth as its main objective, but was increasingly built and based around the idea that it had to be something that recognized a distribution of benefits and burdens. By 2000, when we met with them and developed a 25-year strategy, it was about technology. It was about solar panels, and it was about batteries, and it was about turbine generation and how they could lead the world. And that happened in a blink of an eye. And if you see that one place, you come to believe that it can happen other places. And I think that that's what I would say about this, is that Africa should not be taking a constraint-based view on this issue. It should be trying to look for opportunities and trying to see how it can, again, going back to the conceptual basis, to turn its natural capital base into new forms of capital and new forms of opportunities, the way that China did over that 25 years. And it should negotiate from the position, I think, the countries of Africa, that this is their most important responsibility to their people.
Thank you very much, Tim. And it's the time for the last question that I would like to pose to Ashish. And I want to come back to some of the issues already mentioned early in your contribution, and the problem of stranded assets. In that stranded asset risks seem to be playing out against the backdrop of Africa's rather complicated history with extractive resources, in which different kinds of resource-rich African countries have achieved somewhat poor development outcomes. But I want to sort of follow on Tim's point, and in that asset stranding brings both risks and opportunities, right? And I think unlocking these development opportunities while managing the risks will require, as you mentioned earlier, good governance and effective institutions to drive this common goal. So I guess my question to finalize would be, what is your opinion about the capabilities of African government officials to manage the risks and take advantage of these opportunities? And this could include better resource planning, developing regional markets, and catalyzing sort of research and development in the natural resource space. So Ashish, please, thank you.
Philippe, the issue with some of these concepts, like stranded assets, you know, my graduate studies was in development economics, so I really try to understand these issues deeply. But what I find is that some of these concepts that we learn in great Western universities, when you come to Africa and try to apply them, they don't really make much sense. Stranded assets is one of them. What is an asset to some is a liability to others. Look at Angola, for example. Oil should be a national asset for everybody. It's an asset for the elites. It's a liability for everybody else. It's a complete liability for everybody else. Why do I say that? Because oil, in many ways, has impoverished the majority. It has impoverished the majority because easy money for the country. Nobody's actually working for the money. You have the oil companies out there offshore extracting the resource, selling. Nobody actually sees the crude. The money comes into the country, but only a few people see the money, right? And because it's easy money, they don't have an incentive to strategize on ways to develop the country. They don't. So it's a massive liability. Now, but we have to keep in mind in the case of places like Angola, Nigeria, most African countries, these are very serious risks, very, very serious risks. But we have to remember a couple of things. The promise of independence. The promise of independence, the reason why people, my father's generation, decided to fight for independence in Africa was to create a better life for everybody, not just for some. The continent's natural resources were supposed to liberate the Africans from poverty. That was That was the promise of independence, a new life for all citizens. But when you look at Angola, you look at Nigeria, you look at the Congo, you just look around Africa with very few exceptions, resources have become a liability. Tim's point is very well taken. The whole issue of the resource curse, we have to problematize it a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that in many places, you have a situation where the top president, ministers, they're stealing billions of dollars. The lower ranks are stealing millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and it just goes like that. Again, with specific reference to Angola and Nigeria, those two countries in particular have become a den of thieves. There's no really other way of describing that. There's no other way of describing that. So we have to be very, very careful in Africa to create a situation where natural resources are an asset for everybody. Natural resources are an asset for everybody. How do we get there? We get there with commitment on the part of the leadership. We get there with a tremendous amount of political will. We get there by not trying to replicate failed models that the Europeans, for example, try to implement in Africa. Those models have not worked. So why on earth would African countries try to follow this obsession with growth that was mentioned earlier? It's beyond me. Why is African countries are not sitting down and try to think very critically and very profoundly about African models of development that would bring together the natural resources that Africa has to develop the human capital that Tim was talking about a few minutes ago. These are things that African countries can do and must do. So that's what I would offer as a contribution to this very important question.
Thank you very much, Assis. Thank you. Before I give the floor to Salim for some closing remarks, I want to really take this opportunity to thank our three distinguished panelists today, Gleda, Assis, and Tim, for sharing your expert views on this very complex topic, dealing with natural resources, at least in these three perspectives of commodity sector, its impact on future economic development models, and the climate change issue. I want to thank you mostly for making my task easier, sticking to the time, and for taking a good hour and 15 minutes away from your Saturday. So I really appreciate that. And I'll give the floor to Salim for some closing remarks. So thank you again.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, everyone, Tim, Assis, and Gleda, for excellent positions and contributions for this debate. Indeed, Africa has many challenges. The world is in the model transition of economy. So Africa needs to take the opportunities that you have referred before with the good governance, with the commitment, like Assis told, and with the new measures of growth that Gleda was mentioning before, because GDP is not anymore a good reference, or at least a sufficient reference for growth. We have well-being that is becoming very, very important. Both for this is capital, human capital and social capital. So Africa needs to change their reference for better growth, for better well-being to everyone, and the natural resources to be an asset to everyone, like was before mentioned. I want to thank you, each of you. I want to thank the moderator, Philippe. Very good. And let's see for our next session about our, it will be about the elections of USA and the impact in Africa. That will be in November. Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gleda, again. Thank you, Tim and Ashish. Very nice meeting you all. And
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Bye.
do enjoy your Saturday now. Have a good one, everyone.
You do the same. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.